What makes mainstream media mainstream? Part 2. This is the last sentence I read. So you have a second order of prediction, which is that the first order of prediction is not allowed into the discussion, again with a scattering of exceptions, important ones. The last thing to look at is the doctrinal framework in which this proceeds. Do people at high levels in the information systems, including the media and advertising and academic, political science, and so on, do these people have a picture of what ought to happen when they are writing for each other? Not when they are making graduation speeches. When you make a commencement speech, it's pretty words and stuff. But when they are writing for one another, what do these people say? There are several categories to look at. One is the public relations industry. The main business propaganda industry. So what are the leaders of the PR industry saying internally? Second place to look is at what are called public intellectuals, big thinkers, people who write the op-eds and that sort of thing. People who write impressive books about the nature of democracy and that sort of business. What do they say? The third place to look is the academic sector, particularly that part that has been concerned with communications and information, much of which has been a branch of political science for many years. So look at these categories and see what leading figures write about these matters. The basic line, I'm partly quoting, is that the general population are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. We have to keep them out of the public arena because they are too stupid. And if they get involved, they will just make trouble. Their job is to be spectators, not participants. They are allowed to vote every once in a while, pick out one of us smart guys, but they are supposed to go home and do something else, like watch football or whatever it may be. But the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders have to be observers, not participants. The participants are what are called the responsible men, of course, and of course, the writer is always one of them. You never ask the question, why am I a responsible man? And somebody else, say Eugene Debs, is in jail. The answer is pretty obvious. It's because you are obedient and subordinate to power. And that other person may be independent and so on. But you don't ask, of course. So there are the smart guys who are supposed to run the show and the rest of them are supposed to be out. And we should not succumb to, I'm quoting from an academic article, democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. They are terrible judges of their own interests. So we have to do it for them and for their own benefit. Wow. Actually, it's very similar to Leninism. We do things for you and we are doing it in the interest of everyone and so on. I suspect that's part of the reason why it's been so easy historically for people to shift up and back from being sort of enthusiastic Stalinists to being big supporters of U.S. power. People switch very quickly from one position to the other. My suspicion is that it's because basically it is the same position. You're not making much of a switch. You're just making a different estimate of where power lies. One point you think it's here. Another point you think it's there. You take the same position. How did all this evolve? It has an interesting history. A lot of it comes out of the First World War, which is a big turning point. It changed the position of the United States in the world considerably. In the 18th century, the U.S. was already the richest place in the world. The quality of life, health, and longevity was not achieved by the upper classes in Britain until the early 20th century, let alone anybody else in the world. The U.S. was extraordinarily wealthy with huge advantages. And by the end of the 19th century, it had by far the biggest economy in the world. but it was not a big player on the world scene. U.S. power extended to the Caribbean islands, part of the Pacific, but not much further. During the First World War, the relations changed, and they changed more dramatically during the Second World War. After the Second World War, the U.S. was more or less... After the Second World War, the U.S. more or less took over the world. But after the First World War, there was already a change, and the U.S. shifted from being a debtor to a creditor nation. It wasn't a huge actor in the international arena like Britain, but it became a substantial force in the world for the first time. That was one change, but there were other changes. The First World War was the first time that highly organized state propaganda institutions were developed. The British had a Ministry of Information, and they really needed it because they had to get the U.S. into the war, or else they were in bad trouble. The Ministry of Information was mainly geared to sending propaganda, including fabrications about Hun atrocities and so on. They were targeting American intellectuals on the reasonable assumption that these are the people who are most gullible and most likely to believe propaganda. They are also the ones that disseminate it through their own system. So it was mostly geared to American intellectuals, and it worked very well. The British Ministry of Information documents, a lot have been released, show their goal was, as they put it, to control the thought of the entire world, which was a minor goal, but mainly the U.S. They didn't care much. They didn't care much what people thought in India. This Ministry of Information was extremely successful in deluding leading American intellectuals and was very proud of that. Properly so, it saved their lives. They would probably have lost the First World War otherwise. In the U.S., there was a counterpart. Woodrow Wilson was elected in 1960 on an anti-war platform. The U.S. was a very pacifist country. It has always been. People don't want to go fight foreign wars. The country was very much opposed to the First World War, and Wilson was in fact elected on an anti-war position. Peace without victory was the slogan. But he decided to go to war. So the question was, how do you get a pacifist population to become raving anti-German lunatics so they want to go kill all the Germans? That requires propaganda. So they set up the first and really only major state propaganda agency in the U.S. history, the Committee on Public Information. It was called nice Orwellian title. It was also called the Creel Commission. The guy who ran it was named Creel. The task of this commission was to propagandize the population into jingoist hysteria. It worked incredibly well. Within a few months, the U.S. was able to go to war. A lot of people were impressed by these achievements. One person impressed, and this had some implications for the future, was Hitler. He concluded with some justification that Germany lost the First World War because it lost the propaganda battle. They could not begin to compete with British and American propaganda, which absolutely overwhelmed them. He pledges the next time around they'll have their own propaganda system, which they did during the Second World War. More important for us, the American business community was also very impressed with the propaganda effort. They had a problem at that time. The country was becoming formally more democratic. A lot more people were able to vote and that sort of thing. The country was becoming wealthier and more people could participate And a lot of new immigrants were coming in, and so on. So what do? It's going to be harder to run things as a private club. Therefore, obviously, you have to control what people think. There had been public relations specialists, but there was never a public relations industry. There was a guy hired to make Rockefeller's image look prettier and that sort of thing. But the huge public relations industry, which is a U.S. invention and a monstrous industry, came out of the First World War. The leading figures were people in the Krill Commission. In fact, the main one, Edward Bernays, comes right out of the Krill Commission. He has a book that came out a few years afterward called Propaganda, which became kind of a manual for the rising public relations industry, in which he was a prominent figure. The term propaganda, incidentally, did not have negative connotations in those days. It was during the Second World War that the term became taboo because it was connected with Germany and all those bad things. But in this period, the term propaganda just meant information or something like that. So he wrote a book called Propaganda in the late 1920s. He explains that he is applying the lessons of the First World War, the propaganda system of the First World War, and this commission that he was part of showed, he says, that it is possible to regiment the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments their bodies. These new techniques of regimentation of minds, he said, had to be used by the intelligent minorities in order to make sure that the Slavs, stay on the right course. We can do it now because we have these new techniques. You see? This was an important manual of the public relations industry. Bernays was a kind of a guru. He was an authentic Roosevelt/Kennedy liberal. He also engineered the public relations effort behind the U.S.-backed coup, which overthrew the democratic government in Guatemala. His major coup, the one that really propelled him into fame in the 1920s, was getting women to smoke. Women didn't smoke in those days, and he ran huge campaigns for Chesterfield. You know, all the techniques. Models and movie stars with cigarettes coming out of their mouths, symbolizing the free, liberated, modern woman. He got enormous praise for that. So he became a leading figure of the industry, and his book was an important manual. Another member of the Krill Commission was Walter Lippmann, the most respected figure in American journalism for about half a century. I mean, serious American journalism, serious think pieces. He also wrote what are called progressive essays on democracy, regarded as progressive back in the 1920s. He was again applying the lessons of propaganda very explicitly. He says there is a new art in democracy called manufacture of consent. That is his phrase. Edward Herman and I borrowed it for our book, but it comes from Lippmann. So he says there is this new art in the practice of democracy, manufacture of consent. By manufacturing consent, you can overcome the fact that formerly a lot of people had the right to vote. We can make it irrelevant because we can manufacture consent and make sure that their choices and attitudes will be structured in such a way that they will do what we tell them. Even if they have a formal way to participate. So we'll have a real democracy. It will work properly. That's applying the lessons of the propaganda agency. Academic, social science, and political science come out of the same kind of thinking. One of the founders of the field of communications and academic political science is Harold Lasswell. One of his first achievements was a study of propaganda. Writing in an encyclopedia of social science, he says, very frankly, the things I was quoting before about not succumbing to The things I was quoting before about not succumbing to democratic dogmatisms, that comes from academic political science, Laswell and others. Again, drawing the lessons from the wartime experience, political parties drew the same lessons, especially the Conservative Party in England. Their documents from the period just being released show they also recognized the achievements of the British Ministry of Information. They recognized that the country was getting more democratized and it wouldn't be a private men's club. So the conclusion was, as they put it, politics has to become political warfare, applying the mechanisms of propaganda that worked so brilliantly during the First World War towards controlling people's thoughts. That's the doctrinal side, and it coincides with the institutional structure. It strengthens the predictions about the way the thing should work. And the predictions are well confirmed, but these conclusions also are not supposed to be discussed. This is now part of mainstream literature, but it is only for people on the inside. When you go to college, you don't read the classics about how to control people's minds. Just like you don't read what James Madison said during the Constitutional Convention about how the main goal of the new system has to be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, and has to be designed so that it achieves that end. This is the founding of the constitutional system, but it is scarcely studied. You can't even find it in the academic scholarships unless you look hard. That is roughly the picture, as I see it, of the way the system is institutionally, the doctrines that lie behind it, the way it comes out. There is another part directed to the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. That is mainly using diversion as one kind. That is mainly using diversion of one kind or another. From that, I think you can predict what you would expect to find. Let me read this part again. That is roughly the picture, as I see it, of the way the system is institutionally. That is roughly the picture, as I see it, of the way the system is institutionally, the doctrines that lie behind it, the way it comes out. There is another part directed to the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. That is mainly using diversion of one kind or another. From that, I think you can predict what you would expect to find.